It's my pleasure to hand over to Jack and Roisin, who are going to talk to us today about the fundamentals of data viz and the things you need to think about when embarking on such a project. So Jack, it's over to you.
Thanks, Suze. Hi everyone, I'm Jack. And as Sue said, so the intention of the session today is not necessarily to make people experts in data visualization, and it's not necessarily to go over any specific software for data visualization. But what it is meant to do is to equip you with the mindset that you need in order to start making effective data visualizations. So to begin with then, what is data visualization? Starting with the basics. When we talk about data visualization, what we mean is the use of visual elements in order to represent data. And data visualization can include any kind of visual elements, so graphs, charts, infographics, any visual medium that can help you to understand data. The purpose of a data visualization then is to aid interpretation and allow users to identify trends in the data. So for example, across a time series or geographic locations, to make comparisons and to understand data stories. So data stories are the culmination of all of these trends and comparisons that can allow us to see the underlying real picture. They are the people, the lives, the situations that make up the numbers that we see. So good data visualization then should capture the interest and inform the user with accurate and truthful information. It's also worth pointing out here that there are two primary types of data visualization. That's narrative data visualizations and exploratory data visualizations. So generally today, we're going to be talking about narrative visualizations, which are used to inform others, while exploratory data visualizations are used to better understand our own data. So bad data visualizations, on the other hand, will perhaps fail to keep attention, will be inaccessible, or fail to get the message across. So Klaus Wilk's book on the fundamentals of data visualizations describes bad data visualizations as ugly, bad, and wrong. So ugly visualizations can be technically clear and informative, but look bad, and this can present problems with understanding the data, but also in general has a negative effect on branding and can cause users to switch off. Bad data visualizations then are unclear, confusing, overly complicated, or misleading, and can relate to issues with perception and the user coming to the wrong conclusions. And wrong data visualizations, quite simply, are visuals that are wrong. They can have problems in the methodology or the mathematics behind them and will be objectively incorrect. So honing in there on visualizations that can be misleading, this can often be done intentionally, which is a problem in and of itself, but be careful as it can be done unintentionally as well with the best intentions. So we do recommend to pilot your data visualizations with colleagues. So just go around to show them to people, ask what they think. And this is colleagues who would not necessarily have been involved with the data and the analysis. See what conclusions they can draw from your visualizations and make any corrections where needed. And overall, be careful not to include your assumptions or biases, as visualizations should only give the facts. So, an example visualization here. The visual you see on the screen is an interesting example. So it shows the number of murders committed using firearms in Florida between the 1990s and the 2010s. And as you can see, a point on the chart has been labeled, showing that in 2005, Florida enacted the Stand Your Ground law, which permitted deadly force in self-defense. This is an effective use of labeling in order to show at a certain point on the chart how an event may have had an impact on what was being measured. But there is a glaring problem with this chart, and it's not immediately obvious. It appears by looking at the chart that when this law was enacted, there was a sharp decrease in murders. However, the y-axis, that's the vertical axis, has actually been flipped upside down. So actually what we're seeing here is a sharp increase in the number of murders. This was an infamous chart at the time in about 2014, as so many people misinterpreted it and took away the wrong conclusion. But the author of the chart claimed that it wasn't her intention. She was basing it on this chart, which shows the death toll of the Iraq War. There is a clear and striking visual here of blood dripping down to represent deaths, and that was what the author of the first chart intended. But because of the use of a line chart, this doesn't quite give the actual impression of blood dripping down in the same sense that the other one does, which meant that people just interpreted it as a simple line chart and didn't notice that the axis was flipped. And this is why you should be incredibly careful about the way that your charts are being interpreted, especially when you're doing something unconventional like this, because the last thing you want is to be accused of intentionally misleading people. And this is where piloting it with colleagues and friends can really help you to understand how other people are seeing your data. So then, we'll move on to the basic essentials that you want to understand before embarking on any data visualization project. So the things that you should consider, first of all, are your audience, the purpose of your data visualization, and the data type that you're working with. These will dictate not only what type of visualization is possible to use, but also what will work best with your data in order to get the message across. So first of all, the audience. What is your audience's relationship to the data being presented? So, for example, is your audience the general public with just an interest in the data? Are they the head of a service or a counsellor with a more vested interest in performance? And you should be careful that your data is unbiased to avoid someone seeing just what they want to see. So especially when you've got someone who's specifically looking for something from the data, they may be looking for something specific, and you want to be careful that this bias doesn't come through with the data and that people can actually get the right interpretation from the data. So it's worth considering, does your audience want to see evidence, or do they just want you to walk them through the story? And what level of information do they need for that? So, for example, a service head might need more detail than a counsellor or a member of the public. Your audience's level of expertise then is very important to understanding how complex your data visualization should be and what sort of information you should be presenting. And their mathematical background is also going to be a part of this. Their requirements of access are also very important to consider. So, for example, can your users access the internet or a computer? Would they need a paper report, or would posters in a common area accessible to them, such as a community centre, be more useful? And we will have a section that will go into more detail on accessibility in the second half, and that'll be led by Rashid. So, as an example, this is a chart which is not immediately obvious, but what it's showing is different positions in football teams and the skills that they have. So this is a very complex visual, which is designed to show as much information as possible. And this goes back to what I said earlier about the exploratory versus narrative charts. So this is more of an exploratory chart, and it's very useful for someone who's looking to deep dive into the data and to explore what's going on in order to branch into further charts. But showing something like this in a publication isn't going to be useful to, for example, football fans, because there's so much information here, so much detail, and it would take so many steps to actually understand what's going on here. So while this is great for analysis and for understanding your data, it's not so useful for actually presenting that data. And you may want to break the data down into different forms in order to make the data more presentable and understandable. So next, then, we want to consider purpose. And when we talk about purpose, we mean what is it that you're trying to convey by visualizing this data? It's important to note that even if there's something you're trying to convey, you shouldn't twist the data to do so. So again, we want to give an accurate and unbiased representation of our data, and you should be showing what the data actually says and not just what you want it to say. So what are the key points of the information, and how can we best highlight them? Remembering not to draw in that bias, there's still going to be key points that will come across from the data, and there are ways to highlight them. For example, as we saw earlier, you can label certain points on the chart. You can highlight things with colour. There's a lot of different things that you can do. And also consider, are we trying to inform, inspire, or call to action with our chart? This is a basic point of your purpose, is what you're trying to get across with your chart, and it's going to affect the way that you present the data. So the Financial Times also provides a visual vocabulary, which we find very useful. It's got example visuals based on the purpose of the visualization. This is it on the screen. We'll include a link at the end, and this will be sent out with the slides afterwards as well. But the data is broken down by things such as deviation, correlation, ranking, distribution, changes over time, all of these different things that you could be trying to present with your data. It gives a list of different charts that can show you those things in different ways. And this can give you some more visually interesting charts than just the basics that you would normally think about, such as bar charts, pie charts, and line graphs. And there's nothing wrong with using bar charts, like pie charts and line graphs, but sometimes they're not the best for getting your visualization across. And it's best to consider what sort of data you have and what exactly you're trying to say. So here's an example with talking about our purpose here. This is a hand-drawn chart by William Playfair from the 1700s, and this is talking about the imports and exports from England to Denmark and Norway between 1700 and 1780. And this is a basic line chart showing the imports on one line and the exports on another. But what Playfair did was he highlighted on the chart where the balance was against England and where the balance was in favour of England with labelling and colours. And this is a really effective way to get across immediately to the audience what you're trying to tell them. It doesn't twist the information. We can see that where the balance is against England, the imports are higher than the exports and vice versa. It's just giving us the facts in a form that you can see clearly on the graph and that shows you all the information you need without needing to dig into it. So then the last thing we want to consider then is data type. So what data is it you actually have? And this is really important to think about because you may be asked to present information that you don't have. You would need to maybe do additional sourcing or collections in order to actually provide the information you're being asked for. And you wouldn't want to try and present something that you don't have the data to back up. It's also worth considering how your data is structured. So, for example, certain types of data will only be able to do certain types of visualization. You would only be able to do something like a pie chart if you have something that actually adds up to a whole, and you would only be able to do something like a line chart over time if you do actually have data that goes over time. And this is all part of considering what you can and can't do with your data. And it's just as important to consider what you can't do with your data as what you can, because you can't try to do something with your data that it won't allow you to do because you'll start to present wrong information. So things that you consider are, is the data a time series? Does it add up to a whole? Does it use counts or measurements? So for example, is it discrete or continuous? By which we mean, is it whole or rational numbers, or continuous where it can get down to an infinite number of decimal points? And also you should consider GDPR. So if you're putting data out to users, you should make sure that you are allowed to do so and that it's not disclosive if applicable. So for example, if data could be disclosive, you may need to use suppression in order to make sure that it isn't once it goes out. So an example then here of using the wrong type of data type for a chart. This is a pie chart. There's a lot going on here that's not necessarily right. For example, there's too many colors, too many data items being used on here, so it's quite difficult to discern between the finer points, and there's no labeling. However, the really important thing to note here is that this shows the population density of each local authority in Wales in 2019. And population density isn't something that you can add up to a whole. So this isn't suitable data for a pie chart. And this is maybe something where you would want to use a bar chart. You may want to anyway, even if it was something that could add up, just because there's so many data points on here. But specifically, this type of data doesn't work for a pie chart. So then we thought about the different things that we need to consider before creating our visuals. When we come to actually creating our visuals, there's a few things that we can consider. One is pre-attentive properties. So pre-attentive properties refers to information that we can process without necessarily needing to think too much about it. This is information that once we see it, we understand exactly what's going on, or exactly what's going on without needing to make that thought process. And I'll talk in a moment about what we mean by pre-attentive properties. You can also use titles and descriptions in order to aid interpretation and provide needed context for your visuals. And context can also be conveyed, as we've seen earlier, through the use of labels to highlight any key messages or points in a time series. And as mentioned, it's really important to pilot your visual to understand whether your message is getting across and make sure that it can be understood by others who don't know the data as well as you do. So these are what we mean by pre-attentive properties, and this is taken from Tableau. So pre-attentive properties are all of these things that we see on a chart and we can instantly understand what the chart's telling us. So for example, length we'll tend to see in a bar chart, width we might see in a histogram, we might see things like size on a bubble chart, shapes, enclosure, all these different things that can come together to form our understanding of a visual, and you can mix and match them. Understanding these different properties can help you to create new visuals that are different to what you may have seen before. We've got a couple of examples then of how these can be used. So this is an isotype or a pictogram chart, and this represents weavers in England. And this graph was made in 1939. So there's a lot of pre-attentive properties that are being used here to give us different points of information. So each of these bars across represents a different year: 1820, 1830, 1845, 60, and 80. And in each of these, we can see that there are different points of information. So these small blue figures are meant to be carpets, and these represent the factory weaver. Sorry, these represent the amount of production. And we can see that this production increases over time. These black figures here represent the home weavers, so people who are doing weaving at home, and the red figures represent factory weavers. Now, there's two things going on here with the weavers. One is the use of colour, so black representing home weavers and red representing factory weavers. But we can see also that this is used in closure in order to separate the factory weavers from the home weavers, with a little symbol of a chimney to represent that. And this can have a couple of different effects. And one thing that the author may not have intended, or may have intended, is that it sort of cuts off the factory weavers from everything around them and may make it look as if they're clothed in. And this is just one example of how you can use visuals to really get something across that you're trying to say with your visuals. And it's one thing that you may want to be careful of because it may not be intended. But it's just an example of how you can see a few different effects being used here. Here's another example. So this is from the Financial Times. And this visual represents how far droplets travel through exhalation, coughing, and sneezing. And this was used during COVID-19. And what this visual really shows is that exhalation, the droplets don't go very far, they sort of drop down in front of you. A cough, we can see the green arrow points across, and with sneezing, the red arrow goes all the way across. This is just a really clever use of colour and actual visual imagery in order to represent a piece of information that if you just gave people the numbers of 1.5 meters, 2 meters, and up to 8 meters, it doesn't really give you the impact that you get from this visual. So there's so much more that you can get out of a visual by maybe being a bit more creative and taking some risks. But again, always be careful to make sure that your information is going across properly. So I'm going to pass on now to Rasheen to talk us through the aesthetics of access and accessibility. So Rasheen, take away.
Thanks so much. So on the screen, you should be able to see a rectangle made up of smaller squares, which are color coded to indicate good or bad results. So red indicates a bad result and green indicates a good result. So at first glance, this is a nice visualization. It's demonstrating the overall results are probably leaning towards bad outcomes with no discernible or repetitive pattern. There are 7 different shades to interpret, varying from deep or dark red to pale pink, and then moving into sort of mint green and darker green. The first thing to think about is how much work are we asking our audience to do here? But that's not the main issue. If you're 1 in 12 men or 1 in 200 women, this chart looks completely different. It will look more like this. While it's still possible to see differences in the colour and the tone of the squares, it's far more challenging to interpret than the visual on the left. We see red and green usage in charts, graphs, and visualizations all the time, and that's because of colour therapy or colour psychology. Red is bad and green is good, but for those with colour blindness, it's just not as simple as that. And if you want to know how seriously you should be taking this, 2 weeks ago, we saw Ireland play Wales in the Six Nations for the last time in their home colours. We'll never see that colour combination from those teams again. World Rugby has now ruled that all World Rugby competitions must abide now by new guidelines. And on their website, it says, no matter your religion, gender, sexual orientation, race, ability, or disability, everyone is welcome in rugby. We exist to ensure that rugby is accessible and inclusive for all, and underscoring that commitment, we recognise the challenges that people with colour blindness or colour vision deficiency have participating and experiencing our sports. So countries like South Africa, who usually play in green, and Wales, who play in red, can no longer play against each other in their home colours, and you can see why in this image. So what can you do if you want to use colour in your visualisation? You can still use colour, of course. Contrast isn't an issue for most people who are colourblind. You can darken or lighten your colours respectively to make the contrast more pronounced. You can also play around with different hues as well as levels of brightness and saturation. You can use patterns as seen in this graph on the right, or textures, which are most helpful in bar or pie charts. So this graph on the left, we've got different colours, but they're all represented, the different countries or places are represented with circles, whereas on the right, we can see a change in the symbols. So some do's and don'ts. Do use highly contrasting colours that aren't red and green. Do use patterns and textures, because colour blindness doesn't impact the ability to distinguish between different shades. You can consider making your charts monochromatic, and that just means using one hue. Using a restricted colour palette will naturally mean that there are fewer problematic colours or colour combinations. So just don't overly rely on colours to convey your message. You can absolutely use colour, but don't make it the only thing that explains your data set. And on the screen there as well, we have a list of colour combinations that you can avoid. Now on the screen is a yellow background with black typeface, and this was designed by Daniel Britton, and its purpose is to recreate the experience for some dyslexic readers. The typeface does this by slowing down the reading time of a non-dyslexic person to the speed that might be similar to a dyslexic person. And it does this by removing around 40% of each letter, and that makes each letter almost illegible. So the idea here is to recreate the frustration and the potential embarrassment that reading can cause some of us. Studies indicate that around 10% of the UK population has dyslexia, and somewhere between 10 and 20% of the world population, with 4% of those being severely affected. So what can you do to be more accessible? Keep your sentences short, keep your meaning clear, and avoid academic style essays. The more design elements you add to text, the more difficult it can be for readers to understand. So we recommend using plain language to make text enjoyable and accessible to as many people as possible. You can increase spacing, and that can make text easier to read, and make the most of using meaningful and clear images. There is a dyslexic-friendly font you can use called Dyslexie, and you can purchase that. But doing simple things like ensuring you're using simple fonts and adequate spacing can be really, really helpful. And just a note that yellow backgrounds with black font can be really helpful for people with the severe dyslexia. So you can consider having a paper copy printed on yellow paper if needed as well. Dyslexia doesn't only affect people's reading skills, it can also affect short-term visual memory, sequencing and ordering issues. So that's why we recommend consistency in your formatting and providing an explanation of how things have been ordered alongside your visual. But it's really important to note here that that's really helpful for everyone when you provide an explanation alongside your visual, particularly for people who are new to the topic or new to interpreting data, but it also just helps to avoid misunderstandings. So I'm going to go on to talk now about the aesthetics of access. And the aesthetics of access is also referred to as integrated access. And that just means making content accessible to those with impairments or different abilities. This term originates in the arts and performance world, and it encourages using accessibility as a source of inspiration. So in other words, you're not catering to disabilities or differing neurotypes with add-ons or translations, but you're using that as inspiration for the audience's experience. And in the data world, that means not thinking of access at the end, but including it as part of the process from the beginning. It's a really integral element of the data collection process, right through to analysis and dissemination. Your message, your research, your meaning isn't meaningful unless as many people as possible have equal access to it, can engage with it and do something because of it. So storytelling, even with data, is an art form. And art is an integral part of our culture. And we can see that here from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancements and its benefits. So we're saying here as well that accessibility isn't only a permanent aspect, there are permanent, temporary and situational barriers that can affect any one of us at any time. So it's really important to consider every time you're creating visualizations. It's important here to remember as well that we don't have time to cover every consideration today, and the goal isn't to be perfect. The goal is to improve and to do what we can with the resource that we have. So it's also vital to remember that accessibility is for everyone. So we can let go of any unconscious bias that we may intentionally be holding on to, and always have that in mind. So we've discussed the impacts of poor colour choices already, but what else do we need to consider? I couldn't find an umbrella term for this, but I like the sound of neurotypes or neurologics. I think I'm just kind of making up some new words here, but I want to avoid the unhelpful and kind of frankly biased neurotypical versus neurodivergent framing we often see. What we want to do is consider the whole range of neurotypes. Studies indicate that up to 20% of the global population are neurodivergent, and the indicators suggest that this is likely to rise. So that's approximately 1 in 5 people. And typically, when we're talking about neurodivergency, we're talking about people with autism or ADHD, but dyslexia is also included in the neurodiverse definition. 20% is a really significant portion of the population, so we want to make sure that we're appealing to all neurotypes when we're visualizing our data and when we're communicating. Neurodivergent audiences are more likely to want a page layout that helps them follow and understand the content without getting overwhelmed. So you can use plenty of white space and a mix of images, infographics, and numbers or text. Neurotypical audiences are more likely to cope with animated or busy presentations, but we still need to be really mindful here about presenting things clearly without distracting. Another thing we can do is to consider our audience's age. So some elderly people may not be as familiar with viewing data online. You can create guides or explanations on how to use your dashboards and how to read your visualizations. Using alternative text, audio description, and providing contact details where people can go to you to ask questions is a way to ensure more understanding across the board. And children are accessing the internet at very young ages, so make sure your language is age appropriate, particularly if you need to tell them their rights around GDPR or online safety. Visual impairments, so wherever possible, add audio descriptions or alt text to your visualizations to make the experience as inclusive as possible. And audio. If your visualization takes the form of video or has audio elements, make sure that you've got subtitling and or transcriptions available. We also want to think about digital poverty or barriers to access. And digital poverty is defined as the inability to interact with the online world fully when, where, and how an individual needs to. And with each new development in technology, unfortunately, more people get left behind. And that also makes existing inequalities around race, gender, age, ability, and income worse. 6% of the UK population has no access to the internet, and 20% of young people aged 8 to 24 lack the ability to get online. In Wales, 7% of the overall adult population are digitally excluded. So we've got to keep asking ourselves, how accessible is this method of sharing information? We shouldn't overly rely on using digital methods to share our data. We can work with communities, hubs, and partners to continue to collect and share data in other ways. And we want to think about language as well. So it's critical to understand the impact of the language that we use, whether that's as an individual or as an organisation. We've discussed using simple language, but we also need to be informed and purposeful about the language that we use, particularly when we're describing or categorising other human beings. There's plenty of diversity and inclusion training out there, so Advocate for your audience and start having those conversations in your teams or in your organisation. And if you're already doing that, keep doing that. So whose responsibility is it? There are a number of factors that can limit us from making all of our content perfectly accessible to the whole range of human needs. We're not suggesting providing simultaneous translation or interpretation if the need isn't there. What we would like to see more of is a move to making sure people who have access requirements know that you're open, that you're willing, and that you're informed. It's just about being thoughtful. Inclusion doesn't mean cramming in last-minute add-ons. It means if someone asks for interpretation services, you know to ask them if they have a preferred provider or if you can make the arrangements for them. It means if you're booking a venue to present your data or host a focus group, that you take the steps to ensure that not only is the building accessible, but that there isn't planned lift maintenance scheduled for that day. And constantly asking for information to be accessible or to be easier to interpret can be exhausting, and it is exclusionary. And we know that that is usually unintentional. But it shouldn't be the responsibility of the person who requires access to always have to ask for it, to always have to identify themselves, and to always teach others how to make the content we want to share accessible for them. It's our responsibility to make it accessible. Of course, it's still totally legitimate to ask your audience if they have any access requirements, but it can be as simple as providing a list of options or a list of partners that you work with, instead of simply just asking, do you have access requirements? So it's everyone's responsibility to make experiences accessible. And again, there's lots of training available from some really wonderful organisations around access and inclusion. But let's not forget the why. So humans have always told stories. They've been our means of keeping generations safe, transferring knowledge, instilling ideals and values, exploring new boundaries, and inspiring action. So being accessible matters because it means you're getting more accurate data, and you're going to get far closer to the truth than if you only take an account from a certain characteristic, or if you can only explain the story to one type of person. And don't forget that data is just another word for information. It's a part of the story, and it's really important that we accurately and appropriately represent it when we're telling stories with data. That doesn't mean that we have to leave out the excitement, the intrigue, or the drama. And as we say with all of our training, learning new things takes time. So don't worry about being perfect or doing it absolutely right straight away. Making a start, having a go, having those conversations is the best way to start. So we really hope that you'll go forward feeling inspired and with some confidence that you absolutely have the ability to tell true, exciting, and meaningful stories that are accessible.
Thank you, Rashid. So just to summarize at the end of our session then, before you make a data visualization, you should consider the purpose, the audience, and the data type that you're working with in order to decide what type of data visualization you can and can't use and what type will be best for you. And also, when you're making a data visualization, consider pre-attentive properties that can help you to get your information across more effectively, the chart types that are available to you, and accessibility in order to make sure that your charts and your data can be accessed by anyone who needs it. So we've got a few resources on the screen there, and these will be available in the slides sent out, but these are Coblis, which is a website that you can use to upload an image or screenshot to check it. Color Oracle, which is an app for Mac, Windows, and Linux that will show your whole screen as if it was viewed by a colorblind person with a shortcut to allow you to see how others would see your visualizations. And olderpeople.wales, health and support for advice and guidance from the Older People's Commissioner for Wales. And there's also a link there to the Financial Times visual vocabulary, as mentioned earlier, which gives you options to different types of visualizations that you could use depending on what your purpose and your data type is. So thank you all for coming today. I'll pass back to Suzanne now. Suzanne.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both. That was excellent. Obviously, We've got plenty of time for questions today. We've got a couple in the chat already, so I'll pose those to you and we'll do our best to answer them. But obviously, guys, if you've got any other questions, if you've got anything else you want to ask, then please do add them to that chat bar. So the first one is, how easy is it to create distance charts to scale? So that came up when we looked at the droplets during COVID. How easy is it to create distance charts to scale, and how important is it to do this?
So I assume by distance charts, because you said it was when the droplets chart was up, it's about sort of bar charts and the actual distance between the bars. And
or perhaps how do you know, because the COVID chart showed how far droplets travel. So how do you make that I think is that kind of distance?
I see what you mean. Sorry. Yes. So
I'm just guessing.
So obviously it's going to be with something like that where you're doing more of a custom visual with an image. It's going to be a bit more difficult than doing it with just a program that's going to do it for you. But you can obviously use measurements, work out what the scale would be based on your numbers. And it is important to do things like that to scale, I think, because it really gets across what the actual figure is showing. Because if you don't quite have the scale, you're going to miss out on information. One example that you can see this with is with truncation on bar charts. So that's where perhaps a bar chart, because it's all very high numbers, it doesn't start at 0. But what that can do is by truncating the axis, it makes differences between bars look a lot more pronounced than they are. And I suppose the same would apply to having the scale on a distance chart, where if you don't have that scale quite right, or you're truncating the distance across it, then it can make the figures look different to what they actually are. And even if you have the numbers in there, as we said, having that visualization in there can help you to better understand the numbers, where the numbers might not be as obvious to people and what they're actually saying.
Yeah, your eyes are the first thing you're going to pay attention to, aren't you, and what you can see on the screen. And if you don't get that sense of scale between the different things you're looking at, then you may lose it, certainly if you're not going to then look at the underlying data. Thank you. What is the source? I know this has been answered in the chat anyway, but I'm going to draw attention to it. What is the source of the digital poverty or barrier stats, please? And obviously, Roshan, you've replied to say it was from the Digital Poverty Alliance with a link. So if anybody's interested in those, you can go and have a look there. We've got a question here. I think this is for you, Roisin, if you don't mind. In one of your slides, you suggested that blue and grey is not a great colour combination. Just wondering what the reason is, because there's literature out there that suggests that is a good combination.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think with some of these, it's going to be difficult to kind of have. We try to be totally comprehensive. So it is a very, very small proportion of people who have colour blindness, but there are some people who have colour blindness that lack the ability to see the colour blue at all. So if you can't see the colour blue at all and it's closer in shade to grey, that's not going to be accessible to them. Again, it's not about being perfect. It's just about trying new things and seeing what your audience can kind of cope with. So yeah, there are going to be, the majority of people will be able to see it. It is a very small fraction of people who can't, but they still count.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any more questions for my colleagues today? Sit here awkwardly for a minute while we wait for questions. Obviously, we are all available here as well behind the scenes. But if you want to have any questions after the session, then you can absolutely send them through. The contact details are there on the screen, of course, website address, phone numbers, etc. So do get in touch with us. This, as I say, this session will be recorded, is being recorded, and will be put on our website after the event. And I do think that this as an idea, as an idea for a future training session is something that we are going to be looking at. The notion of data visualizations. What is it that you need to think about before almost you put, I'm going to say pen to paper. We know that's not the case necessarily, but before we put pen to paper, what are the things we're going to talk about? So keep an eye out for that. There will be more of this come in. And we've got one more question actually. Publishing interactive dashboards, Power BI, for instance, on websites could be problematic for accessibility. Any comments, any suggestions? I'm very much putting you on the spot here, Roisin, and Jack as well, I suppose. But you have got any thoughts on what you've come across?
Yeah, so we do know that there are issues around accessibility with Power BI, and also if your visualization has got drill down abilities, so providing things like an explanation of what the image is doesn't necessarily change as people toggle around things. That can be quite difficult. You can build those into some things, but it does require programming knowledge. And it also requires that your audience understands that those things are accessible to them. It's not a perfect science yet. And we're still learning at Data Cymru how to keep doing these things and how to get better at doing them, making them accessible. Jack, I don't know, you've built some Power BI dashboards or worked with them. Do you have any hands-on experience?
It's exactly as you say. It's not a perfect science yet with Power BI. That there are definitely accessibility issues, and like you say, it's all about trying to be as best as we can be with what we're able to do. Power BI obviously offers a lot of visualization tools and what's the word? Not accessibility, ability to change things as you go through using slicers and drilling down. But obviously, as you say, as things can change, that can make it difficult with things like alt text. And Caroline said, having anything embedded in a window or website can cause problems for screen readers. Having the option to click and open a new window will help. So Power BI has built on accessibility issues to make sure that the order is correct and is important, and that's important. Yeah, definitely. So ordering is really important with screen readers in terms of making sure that things are in order, that the screen reader will go through it in logical order. And I didn't know about the embedding being an issue, and but it works better if you open it in a new window. So that's a really good bit of information. Thank you, Caroline.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So we've got another question now. This is an interesting question for you guys. Can you suggest a visualization type to show how much money is spent to date from a defined budget? I should have given you that one to think about for a while, shouldn't I, first?
Yeah, so one that you can do that I think is often used in terms of budgeting and financials is a waterfall chart, where you can sort of keep track of how much is spent in each period, and that can help you to understand how the running total goes. But I think honestly, a line chart is also just a good way to show the amount coming out of a budget, and you can then have it marked out on the chart where the budget is. But I think this is one of those places where it's really good to have a bit of a session of thinking about different ways that you can show it, have a look through the different options within the Financial Times visual vocabulary and other options that are out there, and just have a think about what sort of visualizations you think could show exactly what you're trying to say, because there are a lot of options out there, and there's no one size fits all solution, and it's just really good to have a bit of a session thinking about different things that you can show, and you might come up with some ideas that people haven't before.
Absolutely, thank you, Jack. And I think this was for you again, Jack. Data bias was mentioned. Can you give us an example of this and how to overcome it? What do we mean by data bias? And
yeah, so when I was talking about data bias, there are obviously a lot of biases that come into our data, things like cherry picking certain bits of information. And that would be if you see that, for example, you've got a lot of pieces of information, but only some of them tell the story that you want to tell, that you were expecting the answer to be, then cherry picking would be removing the ones that give a different idea and perhaps don't back up your point, and only showing the ones that you want. And there are I'm trying to think of some other examples of data bias, but it's essentially what we mean there is making the data only show what you're trying to say. I suppose an example then of how bias could come into a chart is going back to that gun deaths in Florida chart where the axis was flipped upside down. That's a very obvious example of where someone has flipped something in order to tell an exact opposite picture of what it actually was. Obviously, in that situation, it wasn't necessarily done on purpose, or so the author says, but it's one example of how a chart can be used to show something opposite to what it actually says. And if the axis wasn't included there, you wouldn't know that it was upside down. But it's all about letting our interpretations of what we want the data to be cloud how we present the data in order to give the picture that we were expecting rather than what the data actually shows.
I hope that has answered your question. If it was in relation to something else, please let me know and we can pose that too. We've got another question here about accessibility. Do you think that there might be a general issue in terms of organisations that print in black and white only for finance and environmental issues? Are there any workaround solutions for black and white data and accessibility?
So the research suggests that the most readable colour combination is black text on white background. So that should be okay for the majority of your audience. I think the workaround is doing things like making it readily available to have in other means and telling your audience that. So you sometimes see it on websites, things, if you would like to see this in this way, just let us know. You can have toggle options, you can have you can work with what website design to change the color, so the people that need it can do that. So yeah, I think black text on white background is the most accessible for the majority, but letting people know that you can have it in with a yellow background, or we'll print it on yellow paper for you, or if you go to deliver training or you going to present something and you have physical copies, just always printing one off on yellow paper as well. Just kind of doing those little things can go such a long way in terms of opening up conversations and improving people's experiences.
I think another thing to add there, you've mentioned this before, Rasheen, but I can't remember if you mentioned it in the session, but in terms of the visuals that we can show, other than using colour, I think you did say about using texture as well as colour. And so, for example, using dotted or dashed lines in a line graph in order to show the difference. Because I'm assuming that the issue is about like it's difficult to interpret between the shading if it's printed in black and white. So having those different textures, sort of lines across a bar in order to show that it's different, that's another option as well.
Thank you both. So those are the questions we had for now. Obviously, if you do have any more questions, please pose them here. And even when the session is down, the chat will hopefully remain open, and Jack and Roisin will keep an eye on to make sure, if you don't want to ask questions there, you can do so afterwards, either via this chat or obviously via contacting us directly. So on that basis, I will draw it to a close and you will get 10 minutes back. So it just remains for me to thank both Jack and Roisin very, very much. Thank you guys for presenting to us today. As I say, we're hoping that this will form the basis, or this is the first of us trying out whether this is there's scope here to do a more larger, more extensive training course on some of these ideas. So keep an eye out for that. Do let us know if you think it's something that we should pursue. And suffice to say, thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you all again at the future sessions. Thank you very much.